Welcome back to episode 10 of the Bible Connection podcast. Guys, this is a weekly podcast that follows our church's Bible reading plan that we might encourage you not to give up on reading your Bibles this year. So, my name's Josh Williams. With me are a couple friends, John Steinke.
Hey there.
Taylor Babcock.
Hello.
And Brandon Stooksbury.
Hey there.
I've done decided I'm going to swap it up every week from now on. You'll never know what's coming, so just be ready. All right, so this week we are discussing the closing chapters of Deuteronomy from chapter 17 to 34. But quickly, we're gonna kind of harken back to chapter 10 because we felt like we missed something we want to talk about. So last week we made the claim that the 10 Commandments are being unpacked through the text of Deuteronomy. So I want you guys to walk us through that a little bit, starting in chapter 10. Specifically, what does Moses say about the law of God?
Well, one of the things that I want to point to is the first commandment, you shall have no other gods before me. We were making the argument that that's what the Shema is kind of expanding out of. And it says in chapter 10, verse 12, "And now Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you? But to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, to keep the commandments and the statutes of the Lord, which I am commanding you today for your good. Behold, to the Lord your God belong heaven and earth, heaven of heavens, and the earth and all that fills in it. Yet the Lord set his heart in love on your fathers and chose their offspring after them, you and above all the peoples, as you are today. Circumcise, therefore, the foreskin of your heart, and be no longer stubborn." Now, I'm not a person that loves to talk about circumcision as a general rule. I mostly work with youth and kids. It's not a topic that's very popular. But when it talks about circumcising your heart here, it's getting back to one of the things we ended the last podcast on when we were talking about how following the law is a heart issue. We're supposed to love the Lord our God with our heart. And in Acts chapter 7, when the Pharisees and the people of Israel and the high priest had rejected Jesus, as Stephen is boldly preaching the name of Christ and sharing the gospel, this is the same way that he criticizes their rejection of Christ, the way that they fail to follow him. He says, "It's the same with you and all of your fathers throughout the generations. Was there ever a prophet that you didn't persecute?" And he says that they failed to circumcise their hearts. And when he says he sees the Son of Man opening up in the heavens, they begin to stone him to death. And so one of the things I think is very important for us today as we read through Deuteronomy and we look at these laws is to recognize that the inward working that needs to be done before we try to outwardly obey God's law. That God's law is meant to be something that is marked on our hearts, something that we follow first in our affections and in the deep thoughts of our mind before we start trying to set out these rules and statutes that we need to walk in.
If you remember back in Exodus when we were talking, or if you've done a study yourself, that the 10 Commandments should be understood as wedding vows. And since that is really the context in which they're given as wedding vows, there's a communication of love between a groom and a bride that is being given to the Israelites in these laws. So as we read here in Deuteronomy 10, and it's referencing back the new tablets of stone, you'll see so much following that passage about circumcising your heart, loving the Lord, and following him. And so much as that is wrapped around the giving of the law and the 10 Commandments that were given were, for an effect, a way to communicate and remember the love and the relationship that you had entered into with God.
Okay, good. Cool. Brandon, do you want to say anything about that, or are you good?
I've got a lot of stuff. I've got a lot of things on other things, so
Okay, cool.
I'll spare you.
All right, moving on. We're going to roll into chapter 18. So chapter 18 talks about how God will raise up a prophet like Moses. So a couple things. What is this referring to? Okay. Other Old Testament prophets, Christ, David, who is this about?
Well, in chapter 18, he says in verse 15, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brothers. It is to him you shall listen. And yet Deuteronomy is going to do this strange thing where at the end it's going to kind of pontificate and say that like there never was another prophet like Moses in all the days. And so what's going on? What is this promise that a prophet like Moses will rise up and that people will listen to him? Well, I think it's important to look at in chapter 17. He starts talking about these stipulations that don't make any sense yet. He says in verses 8 and following what they're supposed to do when there are judges in the land. And then he says in verses 14 and following what they're supposed to do when one day they say they want a king to set over them like the other nations. And this should be something that would resonate with you if you've read the book of Judges before or if you've read the book of Samuel. The people one day will have judges ruling over the land. They will one day have kings ruling over the land and desire a king over them. And I think this is both a building out of the commandment to honor your father and mother. So when you're honoring your father and mother, you're supposed to do it so that you might live long and please God with your life. And here in these commands to follow the commandments of the Lord that you may dwell well in the land, it may go well with you. He's talking about how they're supposed to honor these future leaders that are before them. And we've already seen, and we're going to see again, how God is already showing that they're going to fail. The people are going to one day rebel. They're going to build up these idols. They're going to build up the high places. They're going to fail to keep covenant with God. And he's already providing for the day that they need to be reconciled back to him. And when this prophet rises up, I think personally this is referring to Christ. I think this is already setting the foreground for the idea that another prophet like Moses will rise up, except this time the people will listen to his voice and hear it.
Yeah, and what's interesting about this passage, and it's as far as with the king in chapter 17, you see here that in chapter 17, verse 18, and when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in the book a copy of the law approved by the Levitical priests, and it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by keeping the words of this law and these statutes by doing them. Now, what the king? Why did God put this provision in here for Israel? Right? You think about God. Yahweh has given Israel the law. Right? The law is instruction to them how to live. Right? There's multiple things in here. Israel was to take in the sojourners, take in the oppressed, to do justice to them. Because over and over again it's repeated that they were once sojourners in the land. So now they have the law, right? But God is doing something else to help them. God is giving them a king. And what this passage is alluding to, that this king is to write. First of all, he's literate. Most if not all, other than the Levites were illiterate, right? They were to hear the word of the Lord. But now, not only will they hear the word of the Lord, what God is giving them a provision now is they're going to see what it looks like for what does covenant faithfulness look like? What does it mean? What does it look like to follow Torah? And the king was to be a living embodiment of what it meant to follow the law. And we see, they're mostly bad kings, other than, you can think, Josiah was a good king,
Hezekiah,
but that was God was being gracious to them so that they could see that, that's foundational for the kingship here, so that they could see what the embodiment of Torah looks like. Mm-hmm. But ultimately we see that all of those kings, even Josiah, there's almost nothing said, negative about him. Ultimately, our ultimate king, Jesus, is completely embodying Torah, right? Christ is the end of the law, right? Mm-hmm. Paul is going to say, that doesn't mean, well, the law, it's gone now. No, it's saying the law, the telos, what the law is pointing to is this God King, right, who is completely embodying Torah.
And so that's kind of the point I was trying to make. Just like there's going to be these judges, but when you look at the book of Judges, we're going to talk about this when we get to that episode of the podcast. There's going to be this downward spiral. Right. Instead of an escalation of a better picture of what a judge should be, you're going to be getting worse and worse pictures. And you get that same thing going on when you have the kings. The kings are going to start with David, doesn't get much higher, and they have this downward spiral to the point where all the kings are continually said to be more wicked than any king that lived before them. And you start with a prophet like Moses, and then after him, you start getting prophets who raise up, rebellious children, and then you start getting prophets that refuse to go when they're sent, and then prophets that lay on their side with their mouth glued shut next to a model for a year. It's like
cooking their food in dung.
Yeah, these prophets are they're de-escalating all the way down, but not so with Christ. Here we have the picture of a judge and a king and a prophet, and there's going to be a prophet that will rise up like Moses, but this time you'll hear him and you'll listen to him. And so Christ is going to be the ultimate escalation and fulfillment of all of these, father-like figures that are supposed to be teaching diligently the law to their children as they lay down, as they rise up. And so
there's actually I'm not going into this, but there's an interesting way to cook food with dung, but I'll just, I mean, there's a salt combination. Well, I'll just leave it.
Let's not get into
this. You can make the fire hotter by doing that. I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, sounds good. All right. Deuteronomy 19 through 25, it discussed even more laws. Like, there's just so many laws.
It is called the Torah, the law of Moses.
So, what are we supposed to gain from all these laws from 1925?
Well, there's lots of things that we can gain, and it's not I think we need to kind of push back on understanding of Torah law, because the word Torah doesn't just mean rules; it means instruction, right? So we shouldn't just think of these. These are just they are the text does say that there are rules and commandments, but it's also instruction. Right, so
I'd say foremost it was instruction,
exactly,
teaching instruction, and law was just a kind of a word that was later adapted to it.
Yeah, and the book of Psalms begins in Psalm 1. Blessed is the man who meditates on the law of the Lord.
All right, guys, quit kicking me while I'm down. I made a mistake. Because I called it that.
No, I'm not saying you made a mistake.
No, we weren't making fun of you.
I'm just saying we live in a day a lot of times where we think, and some schools of theology think that it was a bad thing that Israel accepted the law, right? That it was not. I would argue that it was a gracious thing that God gave the law to Israel, right? Hebrews goes as far as to saying that it was good news in chapter 3, I believe. It says, good news came to us also as to them, right? He's talking about the giving of the law. Good news there literally is the word gospel, right? So
I think when we look at like a lot of these chapters here, much of it is specific to the time and place that they're living in. And when we step back, Israel, like before this, what did they have to follow God? So when we look through the Torah and we see all these different laws, much of it is how to be a godly people within the context that they're living. So a lot of these laws, you got to interpret them by their neighboring peoples groups that live next to them too. So if they did this practice, well, the Israelites did this practice, and they would change or modify or maybe even take a concept and then replace it with God, or use it in such a way or uphold it in such a way that communicates God. So much of these laws are given, and not all of them, but much of them are given in such a way to the Israelites as they're living and they're coming out of Egypt and living in Sinai, they're going into the land that God has promised them, how to be a godly people within that context. So as we read those same passages today, some of them are absolutely one-to-one the same. Love the Lord your God. But then some of these, we take and I know Brandon has mentioned this before in a previous podcast, we take the idea of it and the concept of
wisdom.
And we apply it to the modern day or the current situation that applies the same principles. So applying in the same principles of a lot of these cases will, in effect, really communicate the real message of loving the Lord your God. How do you do that? Do that in such a way that within the context you're living communicates that you love God.
And not only loving the Lord your God, which is the first greatest commandment, but also all of the 10 commandments. Because when you look at things like in chapter 19, you shall not move your neighbor's landmark, right? That doesn't mean like a kid is doing something wrong if he's out there and he sees like a rock on the ground, he just moves it. It's a way of not deceiving and bearing false witness against your neighbor and not stealing at the same time. You're not stealing their property. You're not lying to the people. When you see things like, if you build a new house, you shall make a parapet for your roof that may not bring guilt of blood on your house. If you build a house back in those days, a lot of people expect to be able to walk over the top of it. And if you don't make it structurally sound in a way that they could fall through and die. And because of your laziness, because of your flippant attitude towards the safety of your neighbor, you now could be guilty of murder. Their blood is on your hands. And so he's expanding and detailing out what it would culturally look like, what it would historically look like in that moment for the people. But that doesn't mean that we also can't take lessons from it. In the same way, we shouldn't neglect and fail to think through how we're building our homes for the way it could interact with other people. We shouldn't be building our societies and building our homes and building our churches and building our communities in ways that are ignoring the consequences that could come down the road.
Yeah, and scattered throughout this, you find passages at the end of 21. It says, and if a man has committed a crime punishable by death, he is to be put to death. You shall hang him on a tree. His body shall not remain all night on the tree, but you shall bury him the same day. The hangman is cursed by God. You shall not defile the land that your Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance. So first of all, over and over and over again, the repetition of you shall purge this from the land, right? You should, the land is clean, right? But what's happened? What happens? Why are the people that are there before Israel? Why are they being ejected, exiled from the land? Because they've polluted the land, right? What happens here? You see here in the Gospels, the gospel writers allude back to this and talk about how Jesus becomes a curse for us, right? He takes the curse that we deserve, right? By bearing it on the tree, right, he becomes a curse for us. But look at what this passage, if we'll think about it, goes further than what we normally think about. Why is this here? Look at the end of verse 23. So you shall not defile the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Well, if Jesus, who is not cursed, goes on the tree as the curse, he's doing more than just taking our curse. He's cleansing the land, right? So there's multiple of that themes. We talked last week about how being in the land is typological of being in Christ, and how how Deuteronomy is parallel to the book of Genesis, and as John likes to talk about this chiastic structure of the Torah. But you see multiple. There are some interesting things in here. Adam and Eve are ejected from the land because of their sin, right? So I'm sorry, from the garden because of their sin. Well, randomly scattered out through Deuteronomy, you see Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 20, random planting trees, things like this. But you also see, I would bring your attention back to, or forward to Deuteronomy 23 verse 14, and this is a very interesting passage of scripture here, because you do not need to just skip over it, because the Lord your God, Deuteronomy 23:14, because the Lord your God walks in the midst of your camp. Where did the Lord your God walk?
In the garden.
In the garden. Right, the camp of Israel in the land. Israel is the promised land is the new Eden. It was Israel's job as king priest to work and to keep the land and to expand and to continually expand the edges of the garden, so that ultimately we see in the book of Revelation that the whole earth becomes a garden temple. You see in Revelation 20, 21, and 22. But you see, there's multiple things like this about purging the evil from your midst. I mean, this is repeated over and over and over again in the passage or in the book.
And just short, all of these laws and stuff are a picture and a framework that show how to be like God, like within the context, but upholding them all never communicated that they were holy. It was a framework that pushed them toward it. And I look at chapter 24, it talks about laws concerning divorce. Well, when they're asked about that, or when Jesus is asked about it, he says, well, from the beginning it was never so, but because of your hardness of heart, Moses instructed laws about divorce. So there's a framework here that is leading you toward God, but really upholding these in and of themselves do not get you there.
Yeah, and I would like to. I think you're absolutely right, and I want to add on to that. There's this strange passage in it's not a strange passage. I keep saying things like that. It's not strange.
Nothing strange.
Yeah. In Deuteronomy 23, you will see that certain people are forbidden from entering the assembly of the Lord, right, to the 10th generation. But if you look at verse 3, no Ammonite or Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. None of them may enter the assembly of the Lord forever. Well, what's interesting is, as you keep reading in the Bible, and we're going to get to this when we get to the book of Ruth. Ruth is a Moabite, but what's interesting, the author of Ruth is very careful to tell us that Ruth is 10 generations from this curse, right? So Ruth is able to enter into the congregation of the assembly of the Lord, and she's able to enter into this assembly because of this kinsman redeemer. The word is Goel. Right, it's the same kinsman redeemer, and also the avenger of blood is the same word, Goel. Right, so Ruth comes to Boaz's field, right, with Naomi. Right, she comes. Your God will be my God. Your people will become my people. Right, so Ruth enters into the assembly. Right, through she meets Boaz, and what's interesting, this is the reason I named my son Boaz, is because actually it was Allison's idea, but as I got to thinking about this, it was amazing, because Boaz is the first person who's actually called a Goel, right? We learn about the Levirate marriage actually from Deuteronomy, that if there's a marriage and the husband dies, the husband's brother is to take up the wife in order that children may be born, or the closest of kin, the kinsman redeemer, right? Well, Boaz becomes that for Ruth, right? So he does that, but that's not all. Boaz is in the text, he doesn't reap up to the edge of the field so that the sojourners can come in and survive. You know, picking up on what was talked about in Leviticus, and it's also mentioned here again in Deuteronomy. So Boaz, he's also called a Gabor, a mighty man, a man of war, a strong man. It's translated differently in different translations. But Boaz is embodying Torah, right? He's what it looks like to be a Goel, this kinsman redeemer. He, just like the king was to embody it, Boaz is embodying that for the readers, and we see that this passage is the foundation for. You can't understand the book of Ruth without this passage.
So walking off of that, and something you said a few dialogues ago, when we're talking about. I've been waiting to jump in for a little bit here. When we're talking about Deuteronomy here in the law, Boaz is embodying like this Levirate marriage. He's embodying all these things, but Christ is ultimately going to be the one who fully embodies the law of Moses. And I want to encourage everybody as they read through the Bibles, not just the Torah, but as they read through the entire Bible, to remember to look for Christ in the text. And so as we've gone through episode 1 of this podcast all the way up to today, we've been seeing these figures. We've been seeing some being promised that an offspring would come from Eve to Abraham. And then we've been seeing these other figures, and they're just like vile individuals doing ridiculous things. You're like, why are they in the text? Because for every Abraham we have being told that through you, the offspring, the whole world will be blessed, we have Lot, whose daughters are getting him drunk and getting pregnant. But if not for the daughters of Lot getting pregnant, we don't have the Moabites. And without the Moabites, we don't have Ruth. And so for every Boaz, for every kinsman redeemer, you have another woeful, unclean sinner being brought into the lineage of Christ. For every David, you have a Rahab. And what's interesting is when you come into the person of Jesus, Jesus not only is the offspring that comes in order to rescue out God's people, but he also stands as a representative of all of the cursed and all of the sinful in the world. But he stands, and when he's tempted by the devil, when he's tempted to fall into the same sins, he responds with like Deuteronomy chapter 8, right? Be humbled. You had hunger with manna, but man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. And so Jesus, he's going to be the fulfillment ultimately of every one of these pictures and laws that we see throughout the text.
All right, rolling into chapter 27. Moses commands the people to fashion an altar in Shechem between two mountains. And then he begins to utter curses and blessings. So what's the meaning of all this?
Yeah, so this is alluded to back. I didn't bring it up in the last podcast because of this section here. If I can find it. So it's alluded to in Deuteronomy 11, verse 26. See, I am setting before you today blessing and a curse. Blessing if you were to obey the commandments of the Lord your God, which I'm commanding you today, and a curse if you do not obey the commandments of the Lord your God, but turn aside the way I'm commanding you today to go after the gods that are not known. Verse 29. And when the Lord your God brings you into the land that you are entering to take possession of it, you shall set the blessing on Mount Gerizim and the curse on Mount Ebal. And this we get to what it looks like here, and I think Taylor's can talk about the geography of it a little better than me. But Stephen Dempster in his Dominion and Dynasty talks about how what was happening here is Israel is splitting into 6 camps apiece, and going to each mountain, right? And they could have seen each other, right? And the Levites were to mention these cursings to speak it over the people of Israel, right? And what over and over in Deuteronomy and also in other books in the Torah, you will see that if a wrong was committed, right, the person who did the wrong would be sentenced only on the basis of 2 or 3 witnesses. So what's happening here is this is a covenantal cursing. If the people of Israel being on 2 mountains, right, they are witnesses against themselves, right, picking up on this typology of 2 or 3 witnesses. They are witnesses against themselves. If they break covenant, if they break fellowship with God, they're witnesses against themselves that the cursings of God will come upon them. So,
well, when you have this picture, the people are standing on these 2 mountains, and they're, like you said, these witnesses to the blessings and the cursings. We're going to see quite a bit. I don't know how I want to unpack this. The very next passage in chapter 28 is talking about these blessings. And you see, you're blessed in the city, you'll be blessed in the field. You'll have the fruit of the womb, the fruit of the ground, the fruit of the cattle, the fruit of the herds of the flock, in the basket and the kneading bowl, when you come in and when you go out. And this is another example of those merisms that I was talking about, where what it's saying is basically everything in between will also be blessed. Not just, in the field and in the city, but everywhere you go, if you will faithfully obey the voice of the Lord your God and be careful to do what's in the commandments, then you will be blessed. And one day there's going to be 2 other hills, right? There's going to be a hill with the temple, and there's going to be a hill where the Son of God is being hung. And both of them are going to be a testimony to what is changing in the lives of Israel. As one The Son of Man is going to be crucified and die, testifying to God's wrath being poured out. We're going to have the curtain being torn in two, testifying to God opening his presence to his people. And so this idea that the mountain with the curse and the mountain with the blessing, that they're both, standing. You would have seen if you were there at the place of the skull when Christ was crucified. You could look up and you could see the temple in the distance. God is going to be taking everything in between. It's not just this small little valley where these blessings and cursings apply, but to the whole land and to the whole world. And God is going to continue to testify through blessings and curses on his people and on his enemies, his purposes throughout creation.
And I would like, were you about to say something, Josh?
No, go ahead.
Oh, just really quick. Just remember that Deuteronomy is wrapping up the Torah. It's the 5th book, and that the Torah is recording the law, or the Sinai covenant, the Old Covenant, and then there are 5 pieces to that. Remember, the 5 pieces are, number 1, the preamble, which states who the 2 parties are, God and Israel. 2 is the historical prologue. We read much of that in Genesis and Exodus. 3 is the laws that were given within it, and we see a lot of that from all the way until you see number 4, the blessings and curses, which we see here in Deuteronomy 28, and then the summary document, which would have been a ketubah, or otherwise known as the 10 Commandments. So the blessing and curses section is just one more piece of that type of covenant structure, and we see them listed out accordingly.
All right, so Deuteronomy ends with Joshua, one of the most beautiful names I've ever heard in my life, So, anyways, taking over the leadership, and Moses is dying. We're going to be seeing a lot more about Joshua in the coming weeks. So, what can we learn here about Joshua and his leadership? And it begins and what can we learn about Moses as his time on earth comes to a close?
Yeah, so this is something else that Dempster alludes to in his biblical theology of the Tanakh, the names dominion and dynasty. But he talks about how the typology of Moses dying outside the promised land, and kind of like what you were alluding to earlier, John, that Jesus dies outside the promised land. So Moses is a kind of a type of Christ here. But what's interesting is that Moses dies outside, kind of for the earlier he's wishing a curse upon himself, but now he's actually dying outside the camp of Israel, right? But Joshua, whom Jesus's name is Joshua, like that's what they would have called him.
Yeshua.
Right? Yeah, he is leading them into he is leading them into the land, right? Mm-hmm. So,
one thing we could learn about Moses at the end, Moses, it ends in Deuteronomy saying that there never again was there a prophet that was like Moses. And I want to point you to his last song in chapter 32. We keep seeing, "Hear, O Israel, hear, O Israel, hear, O Israel," throughout Deuteronomy. And in chapter 32, "Give ear, O the heavens, and I will speak." And he begins to prophesy even to the heavens the name of the Lord. And he says, "The rock, his work is perfect. All his ways are justice, a God of faithfulness without iniquity. Just and upright is he." And in verse 39, "See now that I, even I am he, there is no God besides me. I kill and I make alive. I wound and I heal. And there is none that can deliver out of my hand." And if you want a picture of the sovereign God, your creator, I want to leave you with these words of Moses as he testifies to God. "I heal and I make alive, and I kill and I wound." He is the God of everything in between. And so God is the total sovereign of creation, total authority over the hearts of men, over the hearts of the Pharaoh, over the actions of the patriarchs. As Joseph said to his brothers when they came up to him, "Do not fear, you've done all this evil. What you meant for evil, God meant for good." And so I want to encourage everybody as they're listening along to trust in this great God that we've seen in the Torah.
Well, I just want to say thank you guys for coming in every week and walking us through this scripture. And thank you, listeners, for joining in. But check it out. There's one thing we love to hear, and that's questions. We love audience questions. And remember, you can share your questions with us. We got an email. It's the Bible Connection, bdbc@gmail.com. Or, if you're intaking this on YouTube, you can just simply leave a comment on the YouTube channel. Or if you see us in church, got our phone number, hit us up. We're definitely excited and ready to engage. So that's it for episode 10, and we'll see you on episode 11.